But as we continue on with Hebrews chapter 12, we're going to be talking about how Jesus is a better example. And I think that Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, especially, are really the heart of what's being said throughout the book of Hebrews from the beginning to the end. And also, perhaps the heart of what Christianity is in a nutshell. And so let's go ahead and begin our study there, reading verses 1 through 2. And then we'll read verse 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. For brownie points, last week, what did we talk about in Hebrews chapter 11? Faith, right? That's right. You weren't even here last week, right? Now you're just showing off. And we talked about faith, and in that faith demands a what? An action, right? And that was the heart of last week. Faith demands an action. Something has to be done, right? And so here in chapters 12, verses 1 through 3, we're talking about Jesus and how Jesus displayed that faith by doing what? What was Jesus' action? It's one of those easy questions nobody wants to answer out loud, but went to the cross, right? Jesus had a faith and trust that God was going to raise him from the dead, and so he went to the cross, right, for our sins. And so if he endured such, we should be able to follow his example, the best example. Hear the phrase, the founder and perfecter of our faith. The Greek words there are arch and tele, which is like archos, which means like beginning or ruler, or teleos, which means like completion or perfect, or it's a word a lot of times that's translated in the New Testament as like completion or the end. And so here Jesus is the founder and the perfecter, literally the beginning, foundation, and the end. Do we see a phrase like that somewhere else in the New Testament talking about Jesus? The Alpha and the Omega, right? The beginning and the last, right? The first letter and the last letter. And so here we have a phrase that's very similar, and the founder perfecter language doesn't really give us that insight. But when you look at the background behind these two Greek words here, really it's the beginning and the end, right? It's something we're going to see later on in Revelation. And so Jesus is the beginning and the end. He's the foundation of our faith, and he is the culmination of our faith. Jesus endured that type of suffering, and so you and I are going to have to endure. The Greek word there that's translated endure is hupomone. It's actually two Greek words that are put together, right? We do this in English quite often. We don't do it as much as the Germans. Anybody ever studied Germany? Germany. Have you ever studied German? No?
I know they combine words.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at German text, right, you'll see a word that's, I'm not exaggerating right now, it's like 27 letters long. Like, it'll be half the line of a page. Because they just take words and they just like throw them together. Like,
that way you don't have to punctuate them.
That's right. Your abbreviations are just all there. And so, but it's quite interesting. But, I forgot what I was talking about. Hupomone. Okay? Two Greek words. Hupa, under, mone, remain. To remain under. Right? We talked about suffering today. We talked about the weight and strain of situations that life oftentimes throws at us. These two Greek words mean to remain under the stress. And when you think about it, is that not what endurance is? Right? To be able to press forward, to remain under the weight of the situation, to not lose your head. And so that's what we've got to do as Christians. Just as Christ endured the weight of the cross, you and I are going to have to endure life and its obstacles to be faithful. That's what we're going to have to do as Christians, looking at his example. And so here we go on to verses 4 through 6, and enduring suffering, which is interesting because what was our sermon on this morning? Suffering, right? Some of you were listening. I appreciate that, right? Some of you need to wake up in there, okay? All right, verses 4 through 6. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastens every son whom he receives. And so here in these three verses, we're told that it's bad. Yeah, you guys are suffering. You guys are being tempted. You guys are being tested. But it could be a lot worse. And couldn't that be said about almost any situation in life that we find ourselves in? I mean, we've all gone through some rough patches in our life, but could it have been worse? Yeah, it could have been worse. And so here this is the idea of, and who's ever said this, right? I'm trying to think of a way to say this without being like culturally inappropriate. I don't know. I'd like to ask you first. No? Okay. All right. Well, I can edit this out of YouTube, okay? Anyways, it's like when you're a kid, right? And you've got your plates and you don't want to finish your plates because you don't like your peas or something. And your parents are like, you got to eat it because there's starving kids in China. And you're like, what does that got to do with the peas on my plate? Right? But that's the idea. It could be worse. Like you don't like your peas, but you could have nothing to eat. So it could be worse right now. And sometimes I use that in my life. I had somebody tell me one time in high school, they were crying because so-and-so doesn't like them or something. And I've become more patient and loving at my older age. I've calmed down. But I was like, you realize 1 million people are going to die this month, like babies, because there's no food? And you're crying because somebody doesn't like you? I was like, come on, man. Grow up. Like I said, I have become more soft in my older age. But the idea is there that it's a defense mechanism, right? If you're going through something bad, you can ask yourself, could the situation be worse? And you can say, it could be worse. And that's one of the defense mechanisms the writer of Hebrews is saying. Realize that, yes, it is bad right now, but it could be worse. And let that be a comfort to you. The quotation he gives here is from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 through 12. And what he says here is that discipline is the same word there. Paideia, discipline and education is the same word, right? For those of you who are teachers out there, do you get to educate your kids? Yes. Do you get to discipline your kids? It's interesting because ancient world didn't believe you could have one without the other, right? Maybe we should bring that back. I don't know. But to discipline a child is to educate a child. You learn, right? When a 2-year-old goes towards a hot stove, right? You can't sit that 2-year-old down and have a 10-minute dialogue about what happens when electricity comes into the burners and it gets really hot and it's 450 degrees, and if you burn your hand, it's going to hurt really bad, and we've got a $2,000 deductible, okay? So, this isn't going to work. Okay? No, what do? You grab the child and you smack his hand, right? And all that child realizes is very close to that stove, I'm getting my hand smacked. Right? But it's for his education. It's for his learning. And so it's the same way even as we get older. Discipline is an integral part of our growth. I mean, think about it this way. We talked about growing in the midst of our suffering as Christians. If you and I never had hardships in life, how would you know that you really had faith in God? If you never struggled, if you never fought, if you never actually had to put your faith into practice, how would we ever grow as Christians? How would we ever rely more on God and less on ourselves if we weren't put in situations that made us realize, I can't do this by myself?
Well, how would you know not to put your hand on the stove if there weren't nerve endings that told you so when you got close?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, because God has made our bodies in such a way where even when other people don't discipline us, our bodies discipline us, right? Those nerve endings, when you touch that hot stove, what happens? Searing pain, right? A preacher friend of mine, Ben Flatt, who was kind of a mentor to me, his dad was in I've forgotten if it was because of a car wreck that happened, but anyways, he had gotten to the point where he had no feeling whatsoever. Like he could function just fine. He had no pain receptors. For some reason, the pain signals in his body did not function. And so one time, Brother Ben said he was putting his dad in the car and he shut the car door. And he slammed his arm in the car door, broke his arm. He never felt it. And at first glance you think, well, it'd be kind of nice not to feel pain, right? And then you think, wait a minute, the pain is there to educate us. This is bad, right? This needs attention immediately. If you don't take care of this, it's going to be bad later on down the road, and it could lead to infection, and you could die. Right? So even when there's nobody else there to smack our hand, God has already wired our bodies in such a way to where our own bodies will smack our hand and say, hey, idiot, don't touch the stove. Brittany and I, we had our anniversary. No, it was not, we got married. Our first anniversary? Doesn't matter. When we went out to Roost Chris, okay? I told this illustration one time. One member said, we're paying the preacher too much. I was like, it's like one time a year, man. All right, anyways. They take the plate and they sit on the table, okay? And it's like the Mexican restaurants. They say, don't touch the plate. It is hot. And you touch the plate and it's like, it's not even warm. Whatever. Okay? They're like, don't touch the plate. It is hot. It's 500 degrees. I heard it and I believed it, okay? It wasn't malicious. But they didn't set it on the table all the way. It was kind of hanging off the table just a little bit. I don't know if it was OCD or what. And about 5 minutes later, I had forgotten. And so I just instinctively went to push the plate up. I burned the mess out of my hand. It was awful, terrible. But they said, don't touch the plate. Why is this relative to what we're talking about? Pain endings. Okay, yeah. All right, suffering. We got to be educated and learn. This is not the point. Right? I mean, we got to move on. I've lost it, okay? 7 through 11. 7 through 11. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom the Father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline in which you have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For if they discipline us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but He disciplines us for our good, that we might share His holiness. For the moment all discipline seems painful, rather unpleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And so here we have the idea that discipline is universal. The writer of Hebrews did not live in 21st century America. You want to know how I can prove it to you? If you read verses 7 through 11, there is a universal truth. We call it gnomic truths, right? Which means truths that do not and cannot change. Okay? The writer of Hebrews believes that discipline is universal. Like I said, he didn't grow up in 21st century America, okay? But discipline is momentary. It only lasts for a little while. For those of you who have disciplined your children through whippings, did you enjoy it? Did you like it? Ed's laughing. Miss Joy, did he like it? Maybe a little bit? Brother Ed, you have to tell us about that later on. But most time parents don't enjoy, right, discipline your child. You do it because why? You love them, right? You want them to be a respectful adult when they grow up, and they need to be trained and disciplined. Okay, he says discipline is universal, but it's also momentary. I mean, yes, we may have to beat them for 30 seconds. 2 minutes if they're really acting out. Right? But, I mean, we're trying to train them for hopefully 60 to 70 years of, righteous and being a good person. Right? A 2-minute beating for 70 years of being a decent person sounds like a pretty good trade. Right? I mean, you're going to take more than one? Okay, 2 minutes times 100, whatever it was. But it's momentary, right? The benefit outweighs the pain. And discipline is for our benefit. It's interesting here that he thinks that it is so universal that he says the only people in the audience right now, I'm talking about when they read Hebrews, if you haven't been beaten as a child, disciplined, it's because you didn't have a dad. That's what he says. It's because you didn't have a dad who loves you. Do we have a discipline problem in our culture today? All right, over 75% of black babies born in the United States are born without a father in the home. Over 30% of white children born in the United States are born without a father in the home. Do we have a discipline problem in our culture? Yeah. Why? Because daddies ain't at home, right? And so we've got to be sure the church is not taking that cultural instinctiveness in. I mean, it's not looked down upon at all in our culture, right? I'm not saying we should look down on people. I'm just saying that we should be sure that as fathers, we don't give up our task and say, you know what, so-and-so, little Johnny doesn't get whippings. Well, little Johnny may not even have a dad at home, right? Us as Christian fathers got to be sure that we're disciplining our children, right? Now, you can decide however you want to discipline. It's not for me to decide. But we've got to be sure that we are disciplining our children and bringing them up in the nurture and admonition in the Lord, because God expects that from us, because He disciplines us the same way. Verses 12 through 17. Therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble by it, that some have become defiled. That no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. And so we've got to be sure that you and I are living a life of being disciplined, living a life that reflects discipline. And that's a life that reflects peace and holiness and the absence of bitterness. If you and I have been disciplined by the Lord and have not grown as Christians, then we have failed the test. Right? The question will not be if we're going to suffer as Christians in this world. The question is, are we going to allow that suffering to make ourselves better Christians? Are we going to allow those hard times in our life to make our faith even more resolved? I think about a lady back in Henderson who had cancer, and she was terminal, and she was on her deathbed. And she left a husband and 4 sons. One of the sons was a student with me at Freed-Hardeman. Wonderful lady. I had and many of you have had someone like this in your family or in this congregation, just had the greatest disposition about her situation. Just couldn't faze her. She never felt bad for herself. She never felt bad for the family she was leaving behind. And it's because she had other struggles in her life that she had come through successfully. And so when she was in the midst of that mountaintop of suffering, if you will, she had already conditioned herself to trust in God no matter what the situation was. Now, if she wouldn't have had those smaller struggles and sufferings in her life on the way to that mountaintop of suffering, we don't know, because there's no way of knowing. But we've got to be sure we're using those situations to better ourselves. Here, the writer used an athletic illustration. Many of you have played sports in your life. Sports is a big deal in the South, right? No one likes to run sprints, unless you're weird. Nobody likes to run sprints at the beginning or the end of practice, right? But why do we do it?
Coach tells them to.
Right? The coach tells them to. Well, we have a coach who just won the region this past week in our assembly. Brian, who's probably upset at me right now. Brian, why do you want them to run wind sprints in practice? Conditioning, right? Because they had good conditioning, they have a higher probability of success, right? So there's an outgo. There's a goal. There's a reason why we're suffering. To win. To have success. And here the writer of Hebrews says, you should be the same way as a Christian. You're conditioning yourself for success. Because if you're not training yourself, and if you can't stand those tests, those battles, you won't have success. And what does success for us mean? Life eternal, right? It's kind of a big deal. So we need to be sure that we're doing what we need to do to get there.
And the other
yes.
thing is, if you look in life at children, at adults who have been disciplined through life and know how to function, their likelihood of success in whatever is always so much greater.
Yeah. I was reading an article this past week in preparation for the sermon. I didn't use it. But it was talking about how, I've forgotten who it was, but they did like the top 400 or 500 individuals, the richest individuals or most successful individuals in the United States. And this was done like the 80s, so it was kind of outdated. But the one correlation that they had saw throughout those top 500 success stories in the United States, like 89% of them had some sort of obstacle or hard time that they had to get through, that resolve. And so, it's the people who have been through more successfully, they've got this grit and resolve about them. You just can't break. You can't shake it. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know. Well, you can ask your wife, right? Baby at 2 years old or baby at 20 years old, they're still mama's baby, right? And so I can understand that'd be hard to break. I'm the baby myself, so I understand how that is. I'm also my grandmother's favorite. Every time I tell her that, she cries. I don't know why. So, anyways, she knows. She says I'm not, but she knows. Okay. All right. So, Israel at Sinai. So, we've got to be sure that discipline is there. And so he goes back to the Israelites in Sinai, who he's already talked about in chapters 3 and 4 about their disobedience, about how God tried and tried in the wilderness, and yet they just would not listen to his word. They just kept rebelling against him. So he talks about Israel at Sinai in verses 18 through 21. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and the tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further message be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, if even the beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. When the Israelites came to Mount Sinai, God dwelt above the mountain. You remember Moses went up there for 40 days and for 40 nights. It was a problem because the Israelites thought that Moses had died on that journey. He had been gone so long, and so they rebelled. Aaron took the gold and fashioned the golden calf, and then we see that. But the reason they were so fearful was because God said, if anything touches the mountain, it's going to be stoned to death because the mountain is holy. And so here, the people just were so distraught by the fire and the smoke. Exodus 19, Deuteronomy chapter 4 tells us those were symbols of God's presence there. About even the innocent animals who were touched in the mountain had to be stoned. They asked Moses to go plead with them on their behalf because they could not take the situation. They were terrified, and they asked God to quit speaking directly to them. Exodus 20:19, Deuteronomy 5:25, and asked Moses to go and intercede for them. And that's when Moses goes on top of the mountain, and unfortunately in his absence, in their fear, right, they turn to jewelry fashioned like a calf, which makes no sense whatsoever, but that's what they did. And so now he contrasts Mount Sinai with Zion, right? And so let's look at verses 22, verse 24. Verses 22 to 24. But you have come to Mount Zion and the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and the innumerable angels in festal gathering, and the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and the spirits of righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. And so now here they are on Mount Zion. And so Zion is a mountain in Jerusalem. It was Mount Moriah in the Old Testament, and eventually became synonymous with the three main things, and that is the offering of Isaac. Whenever you read Genesis chapter 22, when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, okay, that's Jerusalem. Okay, that would later become the site of the temple. Right, that's where the temple was going to be built on Mount Zion, which is formerly Mount Moriah, which is where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. Which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Zion, the temple where sacrifices were made for almost 1,000 years. It's on the same mountaintop, and Jesus was crucified not very far from that same mountain, in the same mountain range, but close to that exact same mountain. And so Mount Zion became this word that was synonymous with God's presence and the future heavenly Zion that we're moving towards. And so it's only used 7 times in the New Testament, and here is one of those times. And so here we're told about the unshakable kingdom that we have. And I want to say before we go into verses 25 to 28, there are 8 things that are listed in verses 22 through 24. There are 8 things that are listed, and I'm sorry if I have that list on this board, that are better now that we're under the Old Covenant. Remember, the main theme of the book is betterness. That is, Mount Zion is better than Sinai. Jerusalem is better than the wilderness. The innumerable angels in festal gathering is better than the Israelites. The assembly of the firstborn under the new covenant is better than the assembly of the firstborn under the old covenant. God, the spirits of the righteous, Jesus, and the blood of Jesus is a better covenant, or the sprinkled blood, a better blood than the blood of Abel. Why does he use the blood of Abel here?
Abel was the first somewhat innocent blood shed on the earth.
Yeah, he says a word though, right? It's a better word. Why is Abel's blood linked to words? Anybody remember? Yeah, Brother Rick, yeah. The blood was speaking out to the ground when God confronted Cain, right? He said, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, right? And so that's the linkage here between blood and words, right? So here we have a better, right? The blood of Christ, right? Speaks louder and more boldly than the blood of Abel, right? And so we have an unshakable kingdom. Why can we stand through sufferings? Why can we stand the test of time? Why can we stand faithful to God? Because we have an unshakable kingdom that cannot be taken away. Let's read verses 25 through 28. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on the earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns us from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. And so here in verses 25 through 28, we're told that God will shake the earth and the heavens. This is also used in Haggai chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And what this is indicating is a cosmic destruction of the world and all that is in it. We know from other passages in the New Testament, even going back in Genesis chapter, I believe it's 10, I could be wrong, it's right in that range, right there where Noah gets off the ark and God sends a rainbow and promises he'll never destroy the earth again by water. Peter tells us in his epistles, because he's not going to destroy the earth by water, he's going to destroy it with what? Fire. And so here he says that the earth, everything that you see, everything that you're worried about, everything that's causing you to suffer right now in this life, God has reserved for it to be shaken. It's going to be burned. In the grand scheme of eternity, those things really mean nothing. And so he talks about the difference between this cosmic destruction of the earth and our kingdom that is unshakable. What is that kingdom? Salvation from Christ, but I'm thinking of an institution. The church. Right, the church, right? Earth is going to be shaken and burned to a crisp. The church, the unshakable kingdom, is the only thing getting out alive, which was the salvation part that you mentioned, Brother Ed. The church is the only thing. If you look at 2 Peter, where it talks about the verse, baptism doth now save you, right? But before that passage, it talks about who? Who's it talk about? An Old Testament figure. Now Moses, Noah, right? And what does he say about Noah? He said the ark brought Noah safely through the flood, right? First destruction. What's bringing us safely through the second destruction? Christ. Baptism in that passage in Peter, the church here, right? It's our ark. It's our avenue. It's the boat that's getting us from this life to the next, and is going to get us through that cosmic destruction. And so you and I who are in the church can rejoice and be grateful and happy that no matter what life throws at us, we have an unshakable kingdom that man can't touch, Satan can't destroy. It's going to be here forever, regardless of what takes place. And if we know that we're part of an unshakable kingdom, then we're going to be able to withstand anything that Satan throws to us. And what's one thing that's a motivation to us? The very last verse of this. Our God is a consuming fire, right? You know, does He love us? He does love us. Will He wink an eye to sin and disobedience? No. The book of Hebrews talks about that almost on every page. And so if we know a cosmic destruction of the world is coming, and that those who don't know God or haven't obeyed the gospel are going to be destroyed in that cosmic destruction, we're without an excuse, right? I mean, to not know something's wrong and to do it, that's questionable. To know something is wrong and still do it, Hebrews would say there remains no more sacrifice for sin. So this morning we're without an excuse. So let us be faithful, let us be a part of that unshakable kingdom, and let us hold each other accountable. Well, the last few minutes we have of class, are there any questions or comments, things that we didn't get to discuss that you think that we need to talk about for a second?
Yeah, I know the comparisons are not totally correct, but I have looked at these chapters of Hebrews and wanted to look back at the end of, especially the 12th chapter of Romans, where those first 11 chapters of Romans are theological. And then it says, because of that doctrine. These chapters before 12 we're talking about the superiority of Christ, of the church, the whole, as you say, 8 different things that are superior. And this chapter talks about personal reactions.
Well, it's kind of like a sermon, right? You can't leave a sermon without having some practical application. And so, which I try most times. Some days, it's just may not work out, But, we've got to have, there's a takeaway, right? Kirk Brothers, right, always says if you preach a sermon and there's no so what, right, you've left something. And so here in Hebrews, we get a so what. Okay, Jesus is better, so what? Well, so be faithful, right?
This is what we ought to live.
Exactly. Anything? Yes, Will? Wes, I'm sorry, Wes.
Talking about suffering, I thought about Job.
Yeah.
Job was like, the devil, God wouldn't let
Yeah. And so Job being faithful, right? The last chapter of Job, he's blessed. He gets twice as much stuff as he had before. And so, well, I see the little ones out there, which means we were all out of time. And I appreciate your attention this morning and your comments. Let's close with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your Son, for the gift of salvation that we can have through Him. Thank you so much for our faith. In the midst of our suffering and trials, help us to be faithful to you and realize that it's an opportunity for us to grow as Christians and molding us into the image of Christ, that we might live with Him for all eternity. Please be with us and help us to share that image with those outside the church in this community. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.